It should not exist. Nintendo wanted it erased. Sony had every reason to bury the embarrassment. Roughly 200 prototypes were reportedly built. Almost all of them vanished, and for more than 2 decades the machine became little more than a rumor whispered through gaming forums. But one survived. If you want to follow the trail of lost consoles that should have disappeared forever, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. Not in Nintendo's archives, not behind glass at Sony headquarters. It survived inside a cardboard box purchased for just $75, overlooked among office junk and left in an attic. By the time collectors understood what they were looking at, they were holding the last known survivor of a decision that changed the entire video game industry. And the strangest part is not how it was found. It is what collectors had to do to stop it from disappearing again. The machine has a Nintendo Super Famicom cartridge slot across the top, familiar gray buttons on the front, and the words PlayStation printed beside a Sony logo. Not PlayStation as one word, but PlayStation as two. That tiny space reveals its true identity. This was built before Sony became Nintendo's greatest rival, when the two companies were supposed to become partners. The story began with a young Sony engineer named Ken Kutaragi. He was fascinated by video games at a time when many senior figures inside Sony considered them little more than toys. But Kutaragi saw something larger. He believed game consoles could become sophisticated entertainment machines, so he secretly began working with Nintendo on an audio chip for the upcoming Super Nintendo. That chip became the SPC 700, the hardware responsible for the console's rich sound. Nintendo got better audio, Sony gained a foothold in gaming, and Kutaragi proved that his obsession had commercial value. So the companies pushed the relationship further. Compact discs were transforming music, but game cartridges remained expensive and limited. A Super Nintendo cartridge might hold only a few megabytes, while a CD could store hundreds. That meant larger worlds, full-motion video, recorded music, and dramatically lower manufacturing costs. Nintendo wanted access to that future, so Sony began developing a CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo. The agreement also allowed Sony to build its own combined machine, capable of playing both Nintendo cartridges and a new disc format called the Super Disc. That machine was the Nintendo PlayStation. From the outside, the partnership looked unstoppable. Nintendo dominated console gaming, while Sony controlled enormous resources in electronics and music. Together, they could have defined the CD era before Sega or anyone else had time to react. But hidden inside the contract was a problem. Sony would gain unusually strong control over the Super Disc format, including licensing rights that Nintendo normally guarded with extreme care. Every successful disc could strengthen Sony's position, so Nintendo began to fear that its partner was quietly gaining control over its platform. The alliance had become a trap. At the Consumer Electronics Show in June 1991, Sony publicly announced the PlayStation project. Executives presented the partnership as the next step in console gaming, so journalists expected Nintendo to support the announcement. But the following day, Nintendo stunned the industry. Instead of confirming its future with Sony, Nintendo announced that it would work with Philips, Sony's European rival, on a different CD system. Sony had reportedly learned about the betrayal at roughly the same time as everyone else. Imagine the scene. One day, Sony is proudly introducing Nintendo's future. Less than 24 hours later, Nintendo is standing beside another company. It was not simply a failed deal. It was a public humiliation. Sony could have walked away from gaming, and some executives wanted exactly that. But Kutaragi argued that surrender would waste years of research and leave Nintendo's insult unanswered. Sony president Norio Oga agreed, so the abandoned accessory became the seed of a completely independent console. The original Sony PlayStation launched in Japan in December 1994. It sold more than 102 million units worldwide, helped move gaming toward three-dimensional graphics, and broke Nintendo's grip on the industry. So Nintendo did not merely lose a business partner, it accidentally created its most dangerous competitor. That makes the prototype more than a rare machine. It is physical evidence of the exact moment gaming history split into two possible timelines. But where did the prototypes go? Reports suggest that around 200 units were produced during development, though the exact number has never been fully confirmed. After the partnership collapsed, most were believed to have been destroyed. A few may have remained with employees, but no verified examples appeared in public. Years passed, so photographs of the machine were dismissed as mock-ups. Collectors debated whether a functional system had ever existed at all. The Nintendo PlayStation became gaming's equivalent of a lost film, documented enough to feel real, but absent enough to become mythology. One prototype, however, had quietly crossed the Atlantic. It was reportedly owned by Olof Olofsson, the former president and chief executive of Sony Interactive Entertainment. Olofsson later worked at a financial company called Advanta Corporation in the United States. When Advanta entered bankruptcy, its office property was auctioned in lots. A maintenance worker named Terry Diebold attended that auction in 2009. He was not hunting for gaming history. He was buying discarded office items, so he paid $75 for several boxes containing plates, cups, CDs, and assorted equipment. Buried among them was a strange gray console. Diebold took it home, but no museum called. No team of experts arrived. The machine went into his attic, where one of gaming's rarest artifacts sat surrounded by ordinary household storage. Think about that for a moment. A prototype connected to a multi-billion-dollar rivalry survived corporate destruction, bankruptcy, and an office liquidation, but its future depended on whether someone mistook it for worthless electronics during a cleanup. The story might have ended there, but in 2015, Terry's son, Dan Diebold, noticed an online discussion about the legendary Nintendo and Sony prototype. He remembered the odd machine stored in the attic, so he posted photographs and video. The reaction was immediate, but it was not entirely welcoming. Collectors had seen too many fakes. The casing could have been fabricated. The logos could have been printed. Even if the shell was genuine, the electronics might have been incomplete. Extraordinary rarity creates extraordinary suspicion, so the Diebolds needed more than photographs. They brought the console into public view. At gaming events, experts examined its ports, controllers, circuit boards, and construction. The hardware contained both Nintendo and Sony branding. It accepted Super Nintendo cartridges, and internal components matched what would be expected from an early 1990s prototype. The myth had become an object people could touch. There was another problem. The cartridge side worked, while the CD drive did not. The feature that made the machine historically important appeared to be dead. So in 2017, hardware expert and YouTube creator Benjamin Heckendorn, better known as Ben Heck, carefully opened the prototype. Repairing it was a terrifying balance. Every component was evidence, but leaving it broken would prevent anyone from learning what it could actually do. Heck traced faults through the aging hardware and restored key functions, including the CD system and audio. Homebrew software was eventually loaded from a disk, demonstrating that the prototype was not just an empty promotional shell. It was a working Nintendo PlayStation. Collectors had now done what two giant corporations had failed to do. They had found the machine, authenticated it, repaired it, documented it, and shared it with the public. But preservation created a new question. Who should own the only confirmed survivor? Terry and Dan carried the console to conventions for years, often transporting it themselves. Insurance, travel, security, and storage became increasingly difficult. $2 million, believing a public auction would establish its real value. In March 2020, Heritage Auctions sold the prototype for $360,000, including the buyer's premium. At the time, it was reported as the highest price ever paid at auction for a single piece of videogamehardware.com and an extensive collector of arcade machines, consoles, and gaming artifacts. His stated ambition was not to lock the PlayStation away forever, but to include it in a gaming museum. That sale sounds like the ending, but the price was not the biggest revelation. The Rarest failed console is valuable because its failure was more influential than most successes. It never reached store shelves, but its collapse pushed Sony to build a console of its own. That console reshaped games, weakened Nintendo's dominance, and created a brand that has lasted for generations. The Nintendo PlayStation is therefore not a monument to what was built, it is a monument to what broke. Perhaps that is why the machine feels strangely human. Its scratched shell, yellowed plastic, and repaired circuits do not represent a perfect plan. They represent rejection, stubbornness, rediscovery, and a second chance no corporation intended to give it. History often survives not because powerful institutions protect it, but because ordinary people look at something forgotten and decide it still matters. If you had found that dusty gray console in a box of office junk, would you have recognized the future hiding inside it? Share what you think, and subscribe if you want to uncover more forgotten machines and the people who refuse to let them disappear.